one of the very first reasons is that the Auburn Automobile Company was founded in 1900 here in Auburn, Indiana. So our history of automotive production goes all the way back to 1900, which is one of the earlier factories to be built in the United States. And Eckridge Carriage Company made buggies and stuff, had their business several decades before that. And the Eckert family is the one who actually started the Auburn Automobile Company. And then when they ceased production about 1938, then we didn't have anything for a while, but then some of the car owners of the Auburns and the Coors and Duesenbergs were having a hard time figuring out how to get parts, how to fix things, and how one guy deals with overheating and another guy transmission wasn't working right or whatever. So they decided to form a club and come back to Auburn, Indiana on Labor Day weekend to get together and kind of have fellowship together and see each other's cars, but also to exchange information on how to deal with problems in the cars, running them, and parts. So there's a guy named Mr. Winslow who bought all the parts from the Auburn Automobile Company when it went bankrupt. He kept the one building there and kept all the parts there. And so there were parts available, but a lot of people didn't pay that much attention to it. So by coming back here, they were able to even get some of the original new old stock parts that were still available at the time. And so that was around 1953, 1954 when they first had that reunion. So then they were having those cars come all the way up through 1971, and more people started coming, and the Auburn Chamber of Commerce was sponsoring the event, hosting these Auburn Coors Duesenberg Club members coming back, and it got to be expensive for them. So they came to our family when we were in the auction business, just in general auctions, and they said, we need to do a fundraiser to raise $2,000-3,000 to help offset the expenses of this. And after we agreed to do that, my dad was watching television. There were only 3 or 4 collector auctions in history in the United States prior to 1971. And there was one on television that my dad happened to see in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it just kind of clicked in his mind, why don't we sell collector cars on Labor Day weekend instead of getting the merchants to give us $10 items or a $20 item and sell it to people in the community? Why don't we sell cars? So we went back and told them, that's fine, however you want to raise the money, you can do it. So we got 2 or 3 guys who were in that collector car auction business, or not auction, but just in collector car business, buying and selling cars. And they agreed to help us. So those 3 guys, there were 3 or 4 guys, and they gave us maybe 30 or 35 of the cars we had in our first auction, and then their friends consigned. And I can't remember now for sure, but
what year was that?
That was 1971, and we had it's 50 or 70 cars, something like that, in our first auction, and it went very well. And for some reason, CBS television sent their Chicago crew out to cover that auction in 1971, and it was in where the Dairy Queen is now in Auburn, at an empty field, and we put up a tent there and had the auction under a tent. And they covered it and put it on national television then, that night. Went all over the world, actually. It went worldwide. 2 fools met today in Auburn, Indiana. The first fool offered $55,000 for a used car, and the other fool didn't take it. He turned it down. And as a result of that, we got calls from other people. So the next year we had like 4 collector car auctions, and then 12 and 20, and got up to having 44 collector car auctions a year with Kruse Classic Car Auction Company, which became Kruse International. So we really were saturating the United States and Canada with collector car auction business. But it all began in Auburn. And we always had, since '71, we've had a Labor Day weekend collector car auction. And for years, it was the biggest and best any place in the United States. Eventually Scottsdale, Arizona, where we started having a sale there in January of '73. I think it was our first sale there, and that got to be a big auction. And then Tulsa, Oklahoma with Jimmy Lake, who had one of those first 3 or 4 collector car auctions back even in the 60s, I think, or even late 50s. And Tulsa became one of our better auctions as well. So we had some others that got good, but Auburn was still the best, still had the most cars, and had most people. I mean, we'd have 150,000 people come to Auburn, Indiana on Labor Day weekend in the 70s and 80s and 90s. It was a big heyday of a town for 13,000.
What was that like? You said 150,000 people.
Oh, it was wonderful. It was hard work. but I can still remember standing in the auction block and just thinking, man, I can't believe this is happening here in Auburn, Indiana, that all these people are here. But they did. They came from all over the world and all of the United States. And we just had, at one time, for several years, we had 3 auction rings. So I'm on a little circle platform here. So we would have these circular platforms. So it'd be up about 3 feet high or 4 feet high. And it'd be a turntable, so the car would turn while we were auctioning it. And we had 3 of those, auctioning 3 cars at one time for 3 or 4 days. And then at one time we had a 6-day auction here with 2,000 cars. It was just amazing. Well, I still remember, and my brothers remember this too, my dad before he died, but we were in Scottsdale, Arizona, so it had been around 76 probably. And we had a bunch of really prized classic cars that were just pristine, very much in demand, rare cars. And I think we sold an hour or two, and my turn came up, and we normally switched every hour of auctioneers on bid calling. And so I started auctioneering, and these good cars coming through, and I started selling every car. So like in 1 hour, I sold every car, and my brother said, keep going, Dennis, we're not going to change, keep going. So I went 2 hours and sold every car, and I went 3 hours and sold every car, and I went 4 hours, sold every car, and it was really one of the best strings of selling every car, because owners have a right to have a reserve, so they don't necessarily have to sell at a high price. But during that 4 hours, I sold every car, and I lost my voice, and I wasn't able to sell the rest of that auction. But my brother said it was worth it, having just one of those things that clicked that particular day with that group of people, and just had wonderful cars there. And then one year we had, I think, about 25 Rolls Royces that had these psychedelic paintings on them, and some, I forget what the guy's name of it. It was I think a Middle Eastern guy maybe had them, and he had his really exotic paint jobs on them. And we sold all of those cars. So that was kind of a store, a national store also. And then another time in Auburn, we had Reggie Jackson had a collection of 100 and some cars in Oakland, California, where he played baseball part of the time. And so he had an unfortunate fire, and they all burned crisp. I mean, it was total loss. So he got his insurance money like in August, and he came to Auburn on Labor Day weekend right after, within a couple of weeks after he got his insurance money. And Reggie Jackson, he's a famous baseball player, and he bid on 200 or 300 cars. He bought I don't know if he bought 100, but he bought 50 or 75 cars for sure, but he was bidding on 200 or 300 of them. Then we had another guy, Herbie Livingston, who was one of the biggest fireworks manufacturers in the country. And he came to one of our Auburn auctions and sat in the front row. He bid on almost every car, and he bought, the most anybody ever bought at one auction. He bought 200 or 300 cars at that auction. And I don't know what happened in his life. He must have struck it rich on the 4th of July that year, selling more fireworks, because he came to Auburn with a bunch of money, and he just bought car after car after car. It was just amazing to watch one guy bid on almost every car.
You've seen celebrities come through.
You've
seen.
Yes.
My favorite's seeing the average everyday person, and they're buying these awesome cars. These cars full of history.
Yes. So we sold quite a few Elvis Presley cars back in the day when he was still alive on some of them. And then we had James Garner, who was Maverick and Rockford Files. He came, sold cars at our auction. And Hugh O'Brien came, who was Wyatt Earp in a television series. And we had Bob Newhart had a comedy show on television, and he sold his car at our auction. He was a really nice fella. The public auction, when we had our public auction, we spent a lot of money in advertising. So we had great exposure, even nationally. On our big auctions, we would do national advertising. Then our regional auctions, we'd advertise in 2-3 state area. And before the auctions, a car like this, let's just say it's worth $250,000 or $300,000 today. Back prior to 1971, this car might have been worth $2,000. And you might have had a hard time even finding $2,000 because there was no place to sell it.
No dealers.
Yeah, there were no dealerships, and it's just maybe a couple guys would handle more than somebody else. But you just happen to have pants, just say, this guy, you want to give me $2,100, they'll make $100 profit or whatever. So it was tough, actually, and the values were way down. So the Duesenbergs that were bringing $1 million, $2 million today, they actually were selling for $5,000 back then. So it was just amazing how the prices, once the public got exposed to it and people with money found out that, hey, I could, instead of buying a piece of art for $100,000 or $500,000, I can buy one of these beautiful cars that I can drive. The art piece you just hang on the wall and look at it once in a while. But these cars, you can get in and drive it, take your friends out for drives, and enjoy having a piece of art that you can actually drive around in. And so it just, the people liked it, and the prices just kept going up. So back in the 70s, prices were going up 10% a month. It was just amazing. They just kept going and going and going until I think around 1980 or so, there was a little bit of dip down then. And we're basically the only collector car auction company at that point. There isn't anybody else that's even doing it. It's more than one or two here and there maybe. And in the 80s, the prices went down a little bit and had a readjustment. And then in the 90s, it went down again and stayed down for like 4 years then. That was the biggest dip I think I can remember, was in the early 90s, like 90 to 93 or 4. And we almost didn't stay in business ourselves because it was just harder to sell cars. Our sales percentages were down, our income was down. Other people started having auctions, competing, once they found out this worked. Other people were trying it then. And we had one of our partners, Leo Gephardt, was one of our early partners from Dayton, Ohio. And at some point in the 80s, we bought him out. And then he went into business against us, which we should have probably did a non-compete, but we didn't. So he was one of the guys that actually was one of the first significant competitors. And then Barrett Jackson, we were together with Barrett Jackson, one of our local sponsors in Scottsdale, Arizona, for about 10 years. And then we had some differences and stuff, so then we broke off. And
so you were working with Barrett Jackson?
Yes, they worked for us. Actually, they consigned cars for us to our Scottsdale auction all through the 70s. And then we split up, and they had an auction, we had an auction. They just had the one auction, and they worked all year on one auction. So they ended up having their auction doing better because we were having 40 auctions a year and you couldn't concentrate as much as they could on one auction. So their auction got bigger and ours got smaller. And then we eventually, I think at one point in time, we might even not have had a Scottsdale auction for a while.
Yeah. But Auburn was always here.
Auburn was always here, and Auburn was actually always a good auction. Even when the ups and downs, the Auburn auction was generally a highlight of it. And a part of that was we had more bidders, more buyers would come to Auburn because of the longevity and kind of being the granddaddy of the collector car auctions. Lots of people came. And then in the late 90s, things were really good. From 94 to 99, we had our best, most profitable times in the Kruse International business. eBay bought us out in 99, and then when they bought us out, they had totally different goal in mind than we had, but they shut down 3/4 of our auctions, and I think we only had, by 2004, I think we only had 10 or 12 auctions left. They just shut them down because they didn't care about the live auctions. They wanted to sell collector cars on their internet site on eBay, which they did, and were highly successful. And eBay Motors today, I think, is about $3 billion a year for eBay, so that worked for them. But as far as our auctions, it didn't work. So then my brother Dean bought it back in, I think, 2004 and tried to rebuild it and couldn't do it. In the other markets, Meekum and Barrett Jackson had 3 or 4 auctions then, and Meekum started getting bigger, and other companies were in the marketplace, and we couldn't get back into the marketplace because my brother lost money then when he bought it back. And then eventually it went to RM Auctions out of Chatham, Ontario, Canada, and they had the auction at the Kruse Auction Park then until just last year, and they decided to shut it down. Yeah. So Worldwide Auctions decided they would rather have a smaller number of cars that are higher quality, pick and choose the sellers who are more, would sell at no reserve or had a low reserve, so there's a good chance they would sell the cars. And over at the RM Auctions, and they would have, or Auctions America, they would have 1,000 cars or 700, 800 cars, and they went down to 300 or 400 the last couple of years. But they would have the big crowd and stuff. But a lot of times our sale total here would be almost the same as theirs, and they would have maybe 5 times more cars than we had. So RM Auctions and Auctions America ended up selling the Kruse Auction Park to a guy who wants to develop into a sports complex for young people. And so that they shut that down and sold it. So Worldwide was having their one night, Saturday night only auction with like 80 cars. And so when they shut down and announced they were going to shut down, then Worldwide decided, hey, let's have a 3-day auction of our own with 300 cars, which they did last year, and that went very well. And so we're now the only auction left in Auburn, but it's good. And I think last year more people came back, and I think we're anticipating this Labor Day weekend we'll have even a bigger crowd. And I think we're going to have just as good a selection of cars for the people. And so I think the crowd will come back, and I think more of the buyers will start coming back, and consigners to offer their cars for sale here, I think is going to increase this year and probably into the future. Well, one of the things that we're using is the word Destination Auburn to make this a place where people want to come on Labor Day weekend. And part of it is we have a big festival. We have a multiple bunch of events happening here, like 15, 20 things happen on Labor Day weekend. The auction is part of that series of events. But we'll have a car show downtown Auburn on Friday night before Labor Day weekend. We'll have 800 or 900 cars, collector cars, for display to the public downtown Auburn around the courthouse square for several blocks. And we have concerts, with free concerts right on the courthouse square. They just have all kinds of events coming in. Now we got sports cars coming in, having a show for sports cars only. And there's a lot of things for people to do. And so I think having it a destination, a lot of times a wife maybe is not as interested as her husband in the collector car auctions. So there's other things. You come to Auburn, there's plenty of things for her to do that she likes to do. So she can actually get out and go see some art displays and listen to a concert and, have a nice time on her own, and maybe take a tour around Auburn on a little bus or something. And so, I think we got a lot of things going on. And that's one reason why we're calling it Destination Auburn, because it is a multiple group of events going on at the same time. Well, I think the heritage is remarkable. The Auburn Automobile Company headquarters is the museum today in Auburn, which is wonderful to come back and visit that year after year. And I think just the tradition of having something that you do that's special in your family every year, and making Auburn Labor Day weekend be part of that special tradition, and bringing your family and friends to this event. It's just people enjoy it. It's a family fun place. It's a wholesome place. It's been safe over the years. So it's really good in that respect as well. So it's just a nice family time to come and spend in Auburn, have Destination Auburn be on your calendar every year for Labor Day weekend.